Hello, one and all, and welcome to a adventure of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, just to announce, Wizard of the Coast had actually provided me a free account to participate within the early access event tomorrow. It is sponsored, so pretty much tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to actually have a full account of all the cards from the current standard set as well as the new expansion, and we're going to try to do some fun brewing shenanigans, essentially. We got a bunch of lists that I do want to test. Like I'll probably link pretty much my deck list profile on the captions below, just so you can see all the decks that I'm considering for the early access brew and such. Nevertheless, though, there is actually a few cards that I'm actually legit excited to actually play with, and I thought I would use this video to just build up the hype, one could say, and actually show off some cards that I'm really excited to play with the upcoming Zendikar Rising expansion. Now, I'm not going to say this is a recommendation crafting video. Some people are really well known on that and know how to recommend the crafts. While I'm more of a jankier brewer, I don't want to recommend something that would be a waste of your precious wild cards. The safest bet, technically, when starting the craft stuff and using your wild cards is probably the dual land cycle, especially in this one, since I do feel like dual land cycle is going to be very good for the if you're a mid-range or aggro deck. So that's probably the closest thing I'm going to make to a recommendation. But all the cards that I'm saying here, I'm not going to say they're like meta cards or they're going to break the meta or anything or they're like automatic crafts. These are just cards that honestly I think they're legit fun to play with. So let's start off the list and talk about the first card that I'm excited to play during Zendikar Rising, shall we? First off, we're going to actually talk. I'm going to actually use this list to be very short and just only talk about a few of the modal flip cards since there's a lot in this set. But I think if out of the whole Mythic cycle, the one that I'm actually most excited to play with is actually Agadenes Awakening. X and 3 black, sorcery, return from your graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that each have a different converted mana cost, X or less. Now, one strategy I always like to do once in a blue moon is always the reanimated strategies, and this is actually just a really, really decent card for the reanimation strategies. Like the factor that if you stock your graveyard and then you could play this like mid to late game to, you could even put this at free and still returning free creatures for 6 mana is not that bad. Especially if they all have synergistic ETB effects. And in mono black, there's a lot of ETB effects that they take advantage of, such as stuff like Gary. Well, I would say Cauldron Familiar, but Cauldron Familiar got the boot. There's even like rats and such. We even got a new card, Acquisitions Expert, which is going to be kind of our rat of the expansion to help us make an opponent discard a card of our choosing. There's even just stuff like the Noble from Locthrain, Aurelia, I think is how you pronounce it. I have a bad time pronouncing that card. Ayera, something like that. But essentially, there's a lot of synergistic black cards that actually essentially get better once you can bring them all out on the battlefield at once. And if you can do a reanimate strategy with Agadenes Awakening, that is great. And even the best part of this, you don't have to necessarily brew your deck around this, just have it as a backup plan, because, as stated before, with this Mythic cycle, it's also land that enters the battlefield on tap, which is awesome. So the factor is you have the choice of whether or not you want to play this as a land. So you could probably play this in mono black without a sweat, and then essentially once you get to the late game and you draw this, you can just play the spell portion without a sweat. So this whole cycle, I am definitely curious. I do think they are going to be definitely meta cards, potentially, but we're going to wait and see on that. Like I said, I'm not going to recommendation crafting this, but this card I am going to have some fun with during the early access expansion. Next up, we're actually going to go through Twitter for this one, and I kind of posted it on Twitter feed, so I'm actually going to use it like that. And my previous note, I did say expansion. Technically, the expansion comes out on Friday, but technically the early access event tomorrow. But the next card is pretty much as it got nicknamed, Louisiana Indiana Jones. That's how the design nicknamed it. It's Relic Robber. 2 and a red for a 2/2 Goblin Rogue with haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they create a token that they can't block with, and it deals 1 damage to them. I just like this card. I don't think it's a powerful card whatsoever, but it's actually kind of a hilarious Goblin card. It's a nice homage to Tuk Tuk, which is pretty cool. But I do think there's just some funny brewing shenanigans you could do with this, especially if you have ways to give it evasion, which, due to the factor that we still have the intro deck in Zendikar or intro deck, due to kind of like them doing the rotation proof intro decks and such, we do have a few cards as well as other cards that we got from Core 2021 to actually make this unblockable. We do have stuff like the Goblin that pretty much makes your creature's power 2 or less unblockable. All you have to do is tap it. That's probably the easiest way to do this. There is also the one card, the legendary Teferi's Wife. I always forget the name of it. But she also has an ability to make a creature power 2 or less unblockable and such. So, just, I think that's how it's worded. I could be wrong on that. I'm having probably brain fart central tonight. But yeah, I'm just excited to see kind of like what type of silly shenanigans you can do with this, because this is definitely one of those cards that if you can get them an artifact, it is kind of a ticking time bomb. Now, on the other side of the coin, I do think if cards like Village Rites or stuff that encourage sacrifice matter shenanigans is popular in the meta, that's probably why this card's not going to be the best in the world. But even if you're just getting one little point of damage in, that's perfectly fine. So overall, I'm just kind of excited to try this card, just because it's a goblin, and I have kind of like a goblin party deck I have in the brewing. All we just have to do is wait for a few expansions, then hopefully get a goblin cleric, and we can play the hopefully mono red. Probably we should probably go Gruul so we can have Grumgoli. The Gruul goblin party deck, which is one of the early access decks I will be playing. So, nevertheless, it'll be fun to see how this Louisiana Indiana Jones of a goblin is going to do some relic robbing of shenanigans, and probably pinning opponents for a few points of damage. Hopefully. Next up, one of the more jankier cards that I am so excited to brew around. It's Lifterform Engine. 4 mana for a legendary artifact at Mythic. Copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Or it has an activated ability of 3 and tap it. Copy target instant sorcery spell. You may choose new targets. Or 4, which is the most exciting part, copy target permanent spell you control, and that copy becomes a token. Now, like I said, this one's not competitive, but boy, there's some fun little brewing shenanigans you could do around with this card. Like, I'm really excited to see. Like, some of the stuff that I'm curious about is how it's going to interact with counter creature spells, like Stonecoil Serpent, or like that Hydra that gets X mana. Because I'm curious if the copy also gets counters too. I believe if it's a into the battlefield with counters, it does. Which kind of makes some funny shenanigans you can do if you have a lot of mana. For example, you could like make your Stonecoil Serpent a 4/4, and then if you have 8 mana when you do that, then you could just tap this down, and then just make 2 Stonecoil Serpents. That's actually really cool. There's also some really silly shenanigans. Even though this is kind of like Magical Christmas Land, you could probably do stuff like copying when it gets cast a Solemn Simulacrum. So get 2 of them, get 2 lands, and then when they both die, draw a card. Plus, there's also one little hint I'm going to give with brewing around this card. If you, for some reason, pulled it and you want to have some fun brewing around it, I would say play this card along with stuff like Zerda. Zerda actually makes this card really nice because it helps discount all your stuff. So then essentially, then the copy target permanent costs 2 mana, copy spell costs 1 mana, and then just the copy triggered ability only costs 1 mana as well. That's very powerful. One thing that I think you can be cheeky with this card, actually try it in a cycling deck of all things. Like, I just thought of this, like maybe you make the Zerda all cycling deck. Because then you could do stuff like, for example, you can, presuming it's on the battlefield, you could do something as simple as just cast a Flourishing Thoughts, tap it for 1 mana if Zerda's on the battlefield, and create a copy of Flourishing Thoughts. Which, when you do cycling shenanigans, that kind of can get ridiculously absurd ridiculously quick. Actually, that's going to be one brew I'll probably brew after this video, now coming to think of it. And then there's stuff like copying Zenith Flare. Also, there's the cheeky shenanigans that if you go into the Jeskai route, you can actually copy stuff like Shark Typhoon and such, so... Yeah, the fact that this can copy permanent spells is really something you shouldn't sleep on with this card, because there are some really silly shenanigans. Like, you can copy your Banishing Lights. You can even do some silly shenanigans where if you have Mythos of Luna, you can just copy Mythos of Luna, which then will make multiple copies of whatever you're copying, which is Very silly when you think about it. There's definitely some silly potential with this card. I think with the potential of artifact hate as well as pretty much enchantment hate in the format, I don't think this is going to be a standard all-star. But is this going to be a cornerstone for a lot of jank decks? Absolutely. Next up, a card that kind of changed my opinion when I reviewed it. Initially, at first glance, I didn't thought much of it, but after I reviewed the card, I am actually a lot more excited to play with this card originally than I thought. Verisol the Split Current. It's in green and blue. We know what it does. It enters the battlefield with as many counters as you put, essentially, as you spend mana on it, and then you can, whenever you cast a spell kicked, I figured out the distinction this time. The spell does have to be kicked to do this effect, so keep that in mind. But if you cast a kick spell, you may remove the two counters and then copy it. There's actually some ridiculously silly shenanigans the more I think about this card that you can actually do with Verisol Split Current. Like, there's some of the obvious ones, like you can copy like an Into the Royal, bounce two Fiends, draw two cards, that's fun. There's also even some silly shenanigans, like there's that one Drake enchantment that has kicker on it, where if you actually pay that for its kick cost, you get a second copy of the enchantment on the battlefield, which then will both enter in with a Drake, so you get two Drakes, which is pretty nice. I mean, even with Myriad Construct, just getting two Myriad Constructs kicked, especially if your opponent's playing a lot of non-basics, is just ridiculously absurd. And while there's some weird interactions with legendaries, because you don't really want to copy legendaries, since legendaries will fizzle, there are some weird exceptions, like Jace, of all things. Because, yeah, you get to copy of Jaces, which, if they are kicked, and yes, one of them will fizzle out. However, you do still get the ETB effect of both Jaces, so you're going to have the one Jace as well as the two mini non-legendary Jaces, which is ridiculously absurd. Like, that could in itself be kind of like a ridiculous draw engine if all the kicked Jace enough wouldn't do it. So, Velisol, I think, is going... Lucky enough, I still think it's still not the most powerful Simic card we ever had, which is good since we had been a lot of annoyingly powerful Simic cards. Thank you, Uro. Thank you, Oko. Eh. But still, I do like this card a lot. This is more like a jankier Simic card. And whenever there's a way to do something janky with a Simic card, I usually am up to the challenge. That or is it? Definitely is it. Or Simic. One of the two. And the last card we're going to talk about that I am excited to play with tomorrow for this video, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our old little power Cheris here. Cheris Raging Isle, just a 0/17, a really big crab with a big butt, and it has an activated ability to make it bigger. What more can you ask for? Plus, it's also really hard to target, with spells specifically, not permanents, so keep that in mind. Still, I am kind of excited to do some really silly shenanigans. Like, the one jank I really want to do with this card is, of course, the one that I think many people already pointed out. Yes, I kind of want to try to do the Embercleave shenanigans with this and try to make it where it has at least 3 to 4 power. Maybe even use a solid footing on it to still make it a 17/17, or at least attack with 17 power, then Embercleave it and just... Oh, the glorious jank that would do with that. There's just some janky shenanigans you can do with this card, and I am so excited to play with this. Nevertheless, that is a few of the cards that I am excited to play with during the early access event tomorrow. I will be doing the Twitch stream starting 6:30 p.m. Central Time. I hope you can all enjoy the silly shenanigans of jank that we're going to play, and you all have a lovely day/night wherever you're at. This is LevDev, signing out.